Mercedes is winning everything, but the FIA just found something that could stop it overnight. 3 races. 3 dominant victories. Over half a second per lap faster than everyone else. And now, new evidence has triggered a full investigation. Because inside that engine, there's a system that passes every test, but transforms completely when the car hits real race conditions. More compression. More power. Up to 40 extra horsepower, without breaking a single rule. And that's why the entire paddock is on edge. Ferrari is demanding answers. Honda is pushing for action. Audi wants immediate changes. And Mercedes? They're not denying anything. They're preparing. So what exactly did the FIA discover inside this engine? Why does it only reveal its true performance at race temperature? And how did Mercedes build something that is legal, but still untouchable? Stay with me, because once you understand what's really happening here, you'll see why this could be the moment that changes the entire championship. But to understand why the FIA escalated this investigation, you have to understand what they actually saw. Because this didn't start with a protest. It started with data. Race data. Telemetry that didn't behave the way a normal engine should. Because when engineers looked closely at Mercedes, they noticed something very specific. The car wasn't just fast. It was getting faster. Lap after lap. As temperatures stabilized, as the race progressed, the performance didn't drop. It improved. And that's not how Formula One works. Normally, engines lose efficiency. Heat builds up. Energy becomes harder to manage. Grip falls away. But Mercedes was doing the opposite. And that's what triggered the deeper analysis. Because once you see something that breaks the expected pattern, you don't ignore it. You investigate it. So the FIA went beyond standard checks. They didn't just measure the engine in the garage. They started studying behavior on track. How power changes over a stint. How energy is deployed. How the system reacts to heat. And that's when the first layer became clear. The compression. Because under normal FIA testing, everything looked legal. 16-1. Exactly within the limit. But when they analyzed real race conditions, they saw something else. A shift. A transformation. As temperatures increased, materials expanded. Internal geometry changed. And the effective compression ratio? Climbed. Not slightly. Significantly. Toward 18-1. And that's a massive difference. Because in Formula One, that jump alone can mean up to 40 extra horsepower. On a car that's already operating at the limit. But here's what made the FIA uncomfortable. This wasn't random. This wasn't a side effect. This was controlled. Designed. Engineered to happen only when the car is running at full performance. Which means one thing. Mercedes didn't just build a powerful engine. They built an engine that behaves differently depending on how it's measured. And that's where the line starts to blur. Because the regulations define limits. But they don't always define conditions. And Mercedes found that gap. But then, the FIA found something else. Something that made the situation even more complex. Because even after accounting for the compression advantage, the numbers still didn't fully match. There was still extra performance. Still an unexplained gain. And that's where the investigation expanded. Into energy. Because the Mercedes system is harvesting more energy per lap than anyone else, deploying it more efficiently, sustaining performance longer. And that combination, compression plus energy, creates something very difficult to stop. Because now it's not just one advantage. It's layered, interconnected, a system where each gain supports the next. And that's why this isn't a simple technical dispute anymore. It's a structural challenge for the FIA. Because how do you regulate something that changes depending on temperature, that evolves during the race, that passes every static test, but behaves differently in motion? You can't just write a rule. You have to redefine how the rule is applied. And that takes time. Time Mercedes is using right now. Maximizing every race, every point, every advantage, before anything changes. But this is where the tension inside Mercedes begins to grow. Because they know exactly what's coming. A new measurement system. A new standard. A moment where the engine will be tested. Not in theory, but in reality. At real temperature. Under real conditions. And when that happens, one question will finally be answered. Not whether the engine is legal, but whether it's still unbeatable, without the advantage they built into it. And this is where the situation inside Mercedes becomes even more tense. Because now, it's not just about what the FIA already found. It's about what they might find next. Because once you prove that one system behaves differently under real conditions, you start questioning everything connected to it. The cooling system, the materials, the energy recovery, the software. Everything becomes part of the investigation. And that's exactly what's happening now. The FIA is no longer looking at a single parameter. They're looking at the entire behavior of the car. How it evolves over a lap. How it reacts over a full race distance. How it gains performance instead of losing it. And that kind of analysis? It changes the game. Because now Mercedes is not being evaluated as a collection of legal components. They're being evaluated as a system. And systems are much harder to defend. Because you can justify one idea. You can explain one advantage. But when multiple advantages connect, when compression links with energy, when temperature links with performance, when efficiency increases instead of drops, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like design. But here's where it becomes even more critical. Because the FIA is under pressure like never before. Not just from teams, from the credibility of the championship itself. Because if fans start believing that one team found a way to operate outside the spirit of the rules, even if it's technically legal, then the entire competition is questioned. And Formula One cannot afford that. So now, the investigation is no longer passive. It's active, expanding, digging deeper after every race, collecting more telemetry, comparing more data, looking for patterns that cannot be explained by normal performance. And that creates a very specific kind of tension inside Mercedes. Because they don't know exactly where the limit is anymore. They know what they built. They know why it works. But they don't know which part the FIA will focus on next. And that uncertainty is more dangerous than any protest. Because now every race becomes a risk, not just of losing performance, but of triggering a decision, a sudden clarification, a technical directive, something that forces immediate change. And in Formula One, those moments don't come with warnings. They come overnight. But here's the most important part. Because even if that moment arrives, even if the FIA tightens the rules, even if Mercedes is forced to adjust the engine, the advantage they've already gained doesn't disappear. The points stay. The wins count. The gap remains. And that's why they're pushing so hard right now. Because they understand something nobody else can control. Timing. They found the advantage early. They exploited it immediately. And now, even if it gets reduced, it may already be enough. Enough to build a lead. Enough to control the championship. Enough to stay ahead even after the rules catch up. So when you look at Mercedes right now, you're not just looking at a dominant team. You're looking at a team racing against the clock, maximizing a window that they know is closing. But the final question, the one that defines everything, is still unanswered. Because when the FIA finally reaches the limit, when every system is understood, when every behavior is measured in real conditions, will Mercedes still be ahead? Or will we finally see what this car really is? Without the advantage that changed everything? And now, we reach the point where everything could change in a single moment. Because there's something about Formula One that every dominant team eventually faces. The moment when the sport catches up to them. And right now, Mercedes is getting closer to that moment with every lap. Because the FIA is no longer just observing. They're preparing. Preparing new directives. New measurement methods. New ways to test the engine. Under real conditions. Not in the garage. Not in theory. On track. At temperature. Under load. Exactly where Mercedes built their advantage. And when that happens, there is nowhere left to hide. Because the one thing that protected Mercedes until now was the gap between how the engine is tested and how it actually performs. But once that gap disappears, everything becomes visible. Everything becomes measurable. Everything becomes controllable. And that's the moment Mercedes has been anticipating from the beginning. Because they knew this wouldn't last forever. They knew the FIA would eventually adapt. They knew the rules would evolve. So they didn't just build an advantage. They built it with timing. Maximize early. Dominate fast. Create a gap before anything changes. And that's exactly what they've done. 3 races. 3 wins. A lead that already feels uncomfortable for everyone else. But here's where the final layer appears. Because even when the rules change, even when compression is limited in real conditions, even when the FIA closes that door completely, there's still something nobody can take away. Understanding. Because Mercedes now understands something the others don't. How temperature can be used as a performance tool. How materials can be tuned to behave dynamically. How energy, heat, and mechanics can work together as one system. And that knowledge doesn't disappear with a rule change. It evolves. It adapts. It finds new ways to exist within the next version of the regulations. And that's what makes this so dangerous for their rivals. Because even if the current advantage is reduced, the philosophy remains. But now, everything comes down to one final moment. The first race after the rule change. The first time the engines are measured in real conditions. The first time Mercedes runs without the hidden transformation. Because that's when we finally see the truth. Not the version that passed inspection. Not the version that adapted with temperature. The real one. And that moment will answer the question that has been building since the very first race. Was Mercedes dominating because they are simply better? Or because they found something nobody else could see? Because if they remain ahead, then this isn't just a clever trick. It's superiority. But if the gap suddenly disappears, if the field closes in, if the dominance fades, then everything we've seen so far will be remembered very differently. Not as pure dominance, but as the perfect exploitation of a loophole that existed just long enough to change the entire championship.